picture this. You're in the South Pantanal, right? Down in Mato Grosso, Brazil. And it's the absolute height of the dry season.
Oh, yeah, the Vazante.
Yeah.
It is just a brutal, brutal ecological period.
Brutal is right. I mean, the sun overhead is pushing temperatures well above like 40 degrees Celsius, and you're wading through this waist-deep water, but you've got to understand, this isn't some refreshing tropical stream.
Right, absolutely not.
No, this water is hot, it's totally stagnant, and it's choked with this dark, heavy mud. The turbidity is so high that visibility drops to zero after like just 5 centimeters. You literally cannot see your own knees.
Yeah, it's an environment that effectively just neutralizes human perception entirely. Beneath that opaque surface, you're operating completely blind, relying solely on tactile feedback. And this is a habitat that is famously unforgiving.
Exactly. And it's in this murky, sweltering soup that researchers stumble upon a site that just, well, it stops them completely dead in their tracks. Floating in the shallows is a young adult caiman.
Which is strange in itself, finding one dead like that.
Right. Because generally speaking, if you find a dead apex predator in the wild, it tells a very loud, very obvious story of violence. But this specimen is perfectly intact. I mean, it's just floating on its side. The powerful tail is still rigid. The eyes are even partially open.
No missing limbs?
No missing limbs at all. There's no churned up mud indicating some chaotic thrashing struggle. And most bizarrely, there are 0 bite marks or lacerations from a larger predator trying to eat it. It hasn't been scavenged at all.
Which, that presents an immediate biological paradox. In a shrinking ecosystem during the Vazante, caloric density is basically the most valuable currency there is.
Yeah, food is money, basically.
Exactly. A dead caiman is a massive repository of protein and fat. Oh. So the fact that nothing has touched it, that defies the fundamental economics of the Pantanal.
It makes no sense. So the research team pulls this heavily armored reptile out of the water to figure out the cause of death. And what they find is just completely baffling. There is just one single deep, irregular puncture wound. Just one. And it's located on the lower chest, right in the softer tissue of the underbelly. And surrounding the single puncture is this terrifying visual marker. It's a prominent black halo of inflamed, rotting flesh that looks like dark ink just spreading aggressively through the surrounding tissue.
Wow. Yeah, the pathology there indicates localized necrosis, or tissue death, that was rapid and severe enough to be fatal. It's a highly specific, mechanically unusual trauma. It definitely doesn't immediately align with the typical predator interactions of that region.
Right. So today on the deep dive, we are pulling from the exhaustive field research and documentary footage compiled by the creators at Apex Truth. Our mission today is to unpack this exact wildlife murder mystery.
And it really is a mystery.
It totally is. We're going to trace this bizarre timeline of dead apex predators, examine the forensic biology behind this invisible killer, and ultimately we're going to completely shatter how you view power dynamics in nature. I mean, I have to ask you listening right now, have you ever assumed that the biggest, most heavily armored creature is automatically the undisputed king of its environment?
Most people do.
Right, because this investigation is going to completely upend that assumption.
It forces a necessary paradigm shift in how we analyze trophic levels. What the researchers at Apex Truth uncovered, it isn't a traditional narrative of a predator stalking prey.
Not at all.
No, we are looking at the biomechanics of an impossible collision in a shrinking high-stress environment. It's really a masterclass in how evolutionary adaptations can trigger lethal consequences entirely by accident.
So let's start by analyzing the victim, because to truly grasp why a single abdominal puncture wound is so, anomalous, we need to understand the structural engineering of a Pantanal caiman. This is not just some large lizard. Calling a caiman a prehistoric tank is kind of cliche, but looking at their morphology, their dorsal armor functions essentially like a non-Newtonian fluid.
Yeah, the mechanics of their osteoderms are just fascinating, because these aren't just scales, they are thick, highly vascularized bone deposits embedded directly within the dermal layer. They form this biological chainmail.
Biological chainmail, I like that.
It's the best way to describe it. When the caiman is swimming slowly, this dermal shield is somewhat flexible, allowing for lateral movement. But the moment it sustains a high-velocity impact, say the bite of another caiman or a heavy blow, these bony plates lock together.
We just lock up solid.
Right, distributing the kinetic energy across a much wider surface area. It's an evolutionary defense mechanism optimized to deflect crushing force and razor-sharp teeth alike.
And their offensive capabilities are just as over-engineered, honestly. When I was reviewing the biomechanical data on their jaw musculature, it's so clear they are built to crush. Their jaw adductor muscles, the ones responsible for actually closing the mouth, are massive and anchored deep into the skull.
Oh, the force generation is immense.
Yeah. We are talking about a bite force capable of easily snapping capybara femurs or shattering the dense keratin and bone of a turtle shell like it's nothing.
And that physical power translates to their aquatic mobility too. The lateral undulation of their muscular tail allows for explosive acceleration. They can literally launch themselves out of the water or pivot instantly to grapple with a threat.
So they're basically living torpedoes.
Exactly. From a purely biological standpoint, a healthy adult caiman in its native aquatic environment possesses near invulnerability. Taking one down requires a massive expenditure of energy and usually results in a chaotic, environment-destroying struggle.
Which is exactly what makes the timeline of these bodies appearing so incredibly eerie. It presents almost like a localized biological anomaly. First, the research team finds that young adult we just described.
Right, the one with the black halo.
Yeah. And at that point, you might hypothesize it was a freak accident, right?
Yeah.
Like perhaps an old territorial wound that had been heavily infected in the stagnant water. But then, precisely 11 days later, and less than 2 kilometers down the exact same water system, they discover a second body.
And the forensic markers are identical, I assume?
Down to the millimeter. Another fully intact body floating lifelessly in the opaque shallows. No missing tissue, no feeding marks, the exact same irregular abdominal puncture, and that same terrifying black necrotic halo degrading the tissue around the entry point.
Wow.
And then the sequence culminates in a third discovery that completely rules out a statistical fluke. This third victim isn't a young, inexperienced adult. It is a massive 2.5-meter long dominant male caiman.
2.5 meters. An animal of that size is an absolute titan within that specific micro-ecosystem. A male that large has survived decades of brutal territorial disputes, droughts, potential predation, everything.
He was the king of the river, and he was found dead near a critical geographical feature. It was this narrowing sandbank that serves as a thoroughfare connecting a rapidly shrinking lagoon to a deeper, permanent channel.
Okay, so a bottleneck.
Exactly, a bottleneck. So within a matter of months, the team has documented 3 dead, heavily armored apex predators. 3 intact, highly caloric bodies just left to rot in the blazing sun. If we were applying human criminology to this, we'd look at the identical wound signatures and the lack of theft, or in this case, consumption, and conclude we're tracking a highly specialized assassin.
Right, a serial killer scenario. But biological systems don't operate on malice.
No, they don't.
They operate on energy conservation. The metabolic cost of killing a 2.5-meter caiman is just astronomical.
Yeah.
And the risk of the attacker sustaining a fatal injury during the altercation is equally high. To expend that much energy and risk permanent injury without consuming the kill to recoup those calories, it's entirely antithetical to survival.
It makes no evolutionary sense. So when the researchers at Apex Truth began the necropsies to figure this out, they noticed something crucial about the wound itself. It wasn't a laceration like a claw dragging across the skin, and it wasn't a compression fracture from a larger jaw. It was a single, remarkably clean puncture. But the trajectory of the wound channel is what fundamentally changed the investigation. The trauma didn't enter from the top down or even from the side. It was an ascending wound. It went from the bottom up.
The bottom up. Well, that vector of the strike completely eliminates a massive portion of the potential threat matrix. Whatever delivered this lethal necrotic blow didn't drop from the canopy, it didn't lunge from the muddy banks, and it wasn't swimming on the surface.
Right.
It had to be positioned beneath the caiman, striking upward into the vulnerable ventral tissue.
So we have an aquatic threat striking from the mud, leaving a highly specific chemical and mechanical signature, and vanishing back into the opacity of the river without eating a single ounce of flesh.
It's a real puzzle.
It really is. So like any rigorous investigation, the Apex Truth researchers began systematically testing hypotheses against the usual suspects of the Pantanal. And naturally, suspect number 1 is the undisputed apex mammalian predator of South America.
The Jaguar. The South Pantanal.
Exactly. It's the most intuitive first hypothesis. During the Vazante, as the water recedes and the aquatic life becomes hyper-concentrated in these shrinking pools, jaguars adapt their hunting strategies. They become highly proficient aquatic hunters.
Yeah, they're one of the few predators on Earth that actively seek out and kill adult crocodilians.
But when you look at the evolutionary biology of a jaguar's skull, their hunting methodology totally contradicts the forensic evidence on these caimans. I mean, a jaguar doesn't stab an animal in the stomach, right?
Not all, no. The jaguar possesses a uniquely robust skull morphology. They have an exceptionally pronounced sagittal crest, which is the ridge of bone on top of the skull.
Right, which looks really intense on an X-ray.
It does. And that provides a massive anchor point for their temporal muscles. This gives them an extraordinarily high bite force quotient. Their signature killing technique against a caiman is an ambush from the bank. They drop onto the reptile's back and deliver a crushing bite directly to the base of the skull or the cervical spine.
They're essentially using those massive canine teeth as biological pitons to separate the vertebrae or pierce the brain case, just shutting down the central nervous system instantly.
Precisely. And that method leaves unmistakable forensic markers. A jaguar strike would result in paired canine punctures. meaning 2 distinct entry wounds, not one.
Right, because they have 2 fangs.
Exactly. You would also find deep, parallel lacerations along the caiman's flanks where the cat's claws grappled the armored hide to secure its grip. Additionally, the sheer violence of that top-down struggle would leave environmental evidence. You'd see churned mud on the bank, displaced vegetation, and very likely jaguar fur caught in the caiman's osteoderms.
And the crime scenes yielded absolutely none of that, and most definitively the biomechanics of a jaguar simply do not allow for a bottom-up puncture. I mean, a 100-kilogram cat is not going to dive to the bottom of an opaque, muddy lagoon, swim underneath a 2.5-meter caiman, and somehow deliver a single upward stab to the abdomen.
No, it's physically impossible for them.
So suspect 1 is unequivocally cleared.
Which forces the investigation to look strictly at aquatic predators capable of engaging a massive target from below.
And that dramatically narrows the field, leading us directly to suspect number 2, the giant yellow anaconda.
The Securi amarella.
Right. If we're looking for something massive that hides in the benthic layer, the bottom of the river, among the submerged roots and mud, a giant constrictor seems really plausible. Perhaps it was a territorial dispute, or an anaconda that attempted to consume the caiman, realized the prey was too large mid-strike, and abandoned the kill.
The spatial ecology of the yellow anaconda certainly puts it in the right place, but again, the physics of their morphology completely contradict the trauma we're analyzing. An anaconda does not possess a single blade-like appendage.
Right. When you examine an anaconda skull, the dentition is designed purely for prehension, not for stabbing or slicing. They have dozens of solid backward curving teeth. They function almost like biological fish hooks.
Yeah, their entire hunting sequence relies on friction and leverage. The anaconda strikes, sinking those multiple rows of recurved teeth into the prey to establish a secure anchor point. Once anchored, they deploy their primary weapon, their immense axial musculature.
It's a squeeze.
The squeeze, exactly. They coil around the prey, utilizing constriction to induce ischemia, which is cutting off the blood flow to the heart and brain.
So, if a yellow anaconda had ambushed these caimans, the physical trauma would look radically different. We wouldn't see a single neat puncture. We'd see catastrophic, chaotic damage.
You would find extensive, localized abrasions where the snake's teeth dragged against the hide. More importantly, the immense pressure of the constriction would likely cause severe internal blunt force trauma. You're looking at potentially fractured ribs, ruptured internal organs, and massive subcutaneous hemorrhaging.
It would be a mess.
A total mess. Even if the snake abandoned the attack because the caiman was too robust, the resulting canvas of injuries would be broad and highly destructive. It would never manifest as a single, precise, deep puncture with a necrotic halo.
So the giant snake theory is completely off the table. Which brings us to suspect number 3. Whenever we encounter senseless, seemingly wasteful animal deaths in the wild, where the bodies are left to rot without being consumed, human involvement is usually the most statistically probable answer.
Poachers.
Poachers.
The illegal wildlife trade is a pervasive and highly destructive element in these regions. The hypothesis that humans were responsible carries a strong logical foundation initially.
It really does. You can easily visualize the scenario. You've got illegal hunters operating from small aluminum skiffs under the cover of darkness. They utilize long, heavy spears, locally referred to as zagayas, or modified harpoons.
Right.
If a hunter thrusts a spear down into the murky water, and the caiman happens to roll defensively, or maybe the spear deflects off a submerged log, it could potentially strike the softer underbelly at an odd angle. This perfectly explains the single puncture wound.
It does, mechanically speaking.
Right. And it also explains the complete absence of predation. Humans aren't eating the meat on the spot. Perhaps the caiman was speared, thrashed violently, broke the hunter's line, and succumbed to the wound days later.
As I said, the mechanics of a harpoon strike align perfectly with the physical dimensions of the wound. However, this theory completely collapses when you apply economic logic and microscopic forensics.
The economics are exactly what I couldn't reconcile when I was reading the Apex Truth Field reports. If poachers are navigating the deep Pantanal during the harshest part of the dry season, they are assuming massive logistical and legal risks. They're doing this strictly for profit.
Exactly, it's a business.
And the ventral skin of a Pantanal Caiman, which is the exact area that was punctured, is highly prized in the illegal leather trade. It's worth hundreds of dollars. Leaving 3 intact, highly valuable skins to rot in the sun is the equivalent of a bank robber blasting open a vault, shooting the guard, and walking away without touching a single stack of cash.
It defies the entire motivation of poaching. The financial disincentive is just massive. But the definitive proof came when the research team transitioned from field observation to laboratory analysis. They performed a meticulous necropsy on the 3rd victim, delving deep into the necrotic tissue of the wound channel.
They were looking for the weapon, because if it was a human strike, a metal harpoon, or a wooden zagaya driven into a heavily armored, violently thrashing reptile is going to leave anthropogenic evidence behind. You'd expect to find microscopic flakes of oxidized iron, metal shavings, splinters of hardwood, or even synthetic fibers from a harpoon line snagged in the tissue.
And they did find fragments deeply embedded in the wound.
But not metal.
No, they were entirely biological. Under high magnification microscopy, the composition of these microscopic shards was analyzed. It wasn't iron, it wasn't steel, and it wasn't wood. It wasn't even fragments of the Caiman's own shattered osteoderms.
This is the crazy part.
The fragments were composed of dentin, coupled with a structural matrix identical to highly mineralized cartilage.
Dentin. Finding dentin completely flips the entire investigation on its head. Dentin is the calcified tissue that forms the primary structure of teeth. So we are no longer looking for a man-made weapon crafted in a workshop. We're looking for a biological weapon.
Yeah, and when the forensic team digitally reconstructed the morphology of those microscopic fragments, they realized they were looking at the shattered edge of a serrated biological structure. The killer was utilizing a living, growing appendage.
Okay, let's just pause and synthesize exactly what this means for the field team. The threat is not mammalian, it's not a reptile, and it is not human. Whatever is systematically slaughtering the most heavily armored predators in the ecosystem is entirely aquatic, entirely submerged in opaque, waist-deep mud, and wielding a serrated, mineralized blade capable of piercing a caiman's underbelly from the bottom up.
The psychological shift for the researchers at that moment must have been profound. Every diagnostic clue pointing toward the land or the canopy was a dead end. The danger was situated entirely within a zone where human visibility is zero.
And the documentary footage from Apex Truth captures the specific turning point brilliantly, and the tension is just palpable. The team is out on the water, mapping the locations of the bodies. You have the ambient, chaotic sounds of the Pantanal, macaws screaming, branches snapping, the low, guttural rumbling of other caimans hiding in the water hyacinths. But once the microscopic dentin analysis comes back, they immediately kill the outboard motor on their boat.
Because the medium they're floating on is no longer just water. It's the suspected habitat of an unknown, highly lethal organism.
Exactly. They are drifting in absolute silence in this small aluminum hull, just lightly scraping over submerged aquatic plants. The air is heavy, smelling of sulfur, hot mud, and decomposing organic matter. And then one of the local guides takes his wooden paddle and pushes it straight down into the water to gauge the depth of the channel. The blade of the paddle vanishes into the brown murk instantly.
It just completely disappears.
Disappears. He pushes it deeper, almost to the handle, before it hits the bottom, and when he pulls the paddle back up, a thick, billowing cloud of black, anoxic mud erupts and stains the surface of the water around the boat.
That visual perfectly encapsulates the terrifying physical properties of the Vazante environment. You are floating over a localized abyss. The water column might only be a meter deep, but because the turbidity is so absolute, it provides perfect crypsis.
Perfect camouflage.
Right. A massive organism doesn't require a deep river channel to remain undetected. It only requires a few inches of suspended silt and soft benthic mud to disappear entirely.
And this is exactly where the investigation shifts from biology to spatial ecology. The researchers needed to figure out not just what was killing the caimans, but where the killer was stationed. And data mapping provided the breakthrough.
They took the exact GPS coordinates of where each of the 3 caiman bodies was initially discovered, and they plotted those points onto a high-resolution topographical map of the lagoon system.
And the distribution wasn't a random scatterplot, was it?
Far from it. The 3 data points formed a highly specific linear trajectory. The bodies weren't dispersed randomly by currents or scavenging. They formed a distinct corridor, basically a narrow underwater thoroughfare that closely hugged the natural contours of the riverbed, connecting the drying lagoon to the deeper channel.
So they identified the kill zone, but knowing where the threat is doesn't really help if you physically cannot see through the water to identify it. So the Apex Truth team deployed a highly specialized piece of technology, side scan sonar.
Using sonar in this context is just a brilliant application of remote sensing technology, because side-scan sonar operates by emitting conical pulses of acoustic energy, basically sound waves, laterally across the water column and down toward the riverbed.
Right, sending up pings.
Exactly. And when these acoustic waves hit an object, they bounce back to the transducer. The system measures the time it takes for the echo to return and the intensity of that echo. By analyzing the acoustic shadows cast by objects on the bottom, the software generates a highly detailed, nearly photographic, topographical map of the benthic layer, completely bypassing the issue of water clarity.
It essentially strips away the mud using sound.
That's a great way to put it.
So the team is slowly, methodically sweeping this sonar array back and forth over the GPS-identified kill corridor. The monitor on the boat is scrolling, showing the typical clutter of a riverbed, sunken tree trunks, deep depressions in the sand, dense schools of small fish. And then, situated directly in the middle of the narrowing sandbank, exactly along the trajectory the dead caimans had taken, an anomaly appears on the screen.
an acoustic shadow that does not conform to the surrounding geological features.
It is massive. It's perfectly flat, and geometrically, it is almost a perfect circle. And the sonar indicates it's partially buried beneath the top layer of sediment. So they circle back and run the sonar over the exact same coordinates. The circular shape is still there. On the third pass, the acoustic imaging captures movement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the leading edge of this massive disk lifts slightly, a huge cloud of sediment billows up on the digital readout, and the circular shape glides forward, revealing a thick, highly muscular appendage trailing behind it.
The invisible killer finally had a morphological silhouette.
And what a staggering silhouette it was. The sonar had located Potamotrygon Brachyura, the giant short-tailed river stingray. Now, for anyone listening, we need to completely recalibrate what you picture when you hear the word stingray. We are not talking about the small, docile creatures gliding around a shallow touch pool at a municipal aquarium.
Absolutely not. The Potamotrygon genus is unique. These are freshwater stingrays, highly adapted and strictly endemic to the massive river basins of South America, specifically the Paraná, Paraguay, and Uruguay river systems.
They only live in fresh water.
Only freshwater. They actually evolved from marine ancestors that were trapped in the continent's interior millions of years ago when the Andes Mountains rose and altered the flow of the Amazon basin. So they are biologically engineered for these exact river systems. And Potamotrygon brachyura is widely recognized as one of the largest exclusively freshwater rays on the planet. But the specific specimen the sonar captured in that kill corridor was an extreme outlier.
It was a true river monster.
The acoustic measurements indicated it was a colossal female. Biologists estimate her disc width approached 2 meters in diameter.
2 meters.
That is well over 6 feet across.
A 6-foot wide disc of solid muscle. What does an animal with those dimensions even weigh?
A female that immense circumference would easily exceed 100 kilograms. Over 220 pounds of dense, flat, highly venomous biological power, resting completely imperceptible beneath a thin layer of mud and water that wouldn't even reach your chest.
Unbelievable. So the investigation has its culprit. But this is the exact moment where the entire narrative of this deep dive takes a massive foundational pivot. Because everything we've established so far, the terminology of a serial killer, the murder mystery, the concept of an assassin stalking the kill corridor, it's all a profound misdirection born from our own inherent human biases regarding how predators and prey interact.
Exactly that. When human beings observe a dead body in nature, our immediate cognitive bias is to assume predation or aggressive territoriality. We assume a hunt took place.
Right, that there's a bad guy and a victim.
Right. But this colossal stingray was not hunting the caimans. She had zero biological incentive to kill them, and she possessed absolutely no interest in them as a potential food source.
Let's look at the morphology of a benthic feeder to explain why. Even at 100 kilograms, a river stingray's mouth is located entirely on the ventral side, the underside of its body. They don't have the jaw structure, the biting force, or the necessary dentition to tear chunks of flesh out of a large armored vertebrate like a caiman.
Their feeding mechanism is highly specialized for a completely different diet. They hover just above the benthic layer, essentially acting as biological vacuum cleaners. They utilize their pectoral fins to generate negative pressure, sucking small invertebrates, crustaceans, aquatic mollusks, and small benthic fish out of the mud.
So they're eating little crunchy things.
Exactly. Their jaws are equipped with flattened plates designed to crush shells, not to shear meat. From a trophic perspective, attacking a caiman for food is physically impossible for her.
So if she physically cannot eat them, why is she positioned in this corridor, leaving a trail of dead 2.5-meter apex reptiles in her wake?
Because every single fatality was the result of a reflexive, unadulterated act of defense.
Defense. We need to break down the biomechanics of this defensive mechanism because comparing the stingray to a traditional animal wildly undersells what she actually is. Functionally, biologically, and ecologically, she is operating as a living landmine.
That analogy perfectly captures her survival strategy. Her primary defense is absolute crypsis. Her flattened morphology allows her to settle flush against the riverbed. By undulating the outer margins of her immense pectoral fins, she purposefully kicks up a cloud of fine silt and sediment.
She buries herself.
Yes, and as that sediment settles, it coats her dorsal surface, perfectly matching the substrate. Combined with her naturally modeled, reticulated skin pattern, her visual silhouette is completely obliterated. She becomes entirely one with the mud.
But she still has to breathe, right? How does she manage respiration while buried beneath anoxic mud?
That is where her specialized anatomy comes in. While her mouth is buried in the mud, she possesses large spiracles, which are respiratory openings, located on the top of her head, just behind her elevated eyes. She pulls clean, oxygenated water in through these dorsal spiracles, passes it over her gills to extract the oxygen, and expels it ventrally. She can remain perfectly stationary, perfectly camouflaged, and fully oxygenated for hours or even days.
So she is lying there, practically invisible. And here comes our caiman, moving down the shrinking channel. Now the caiman is also utilizing crypsis. It's swimming low, its heavy armored belly practically dragging across the benthic mud, trying to remain undetected so it can ambush a capybara or a shoal of fish. The opacity of the water prevents the caiman from seeing the buried ray.
And the ray, being entirely stationary, likely doesn't perceive the caiman as a threat until the physical mass is directly overhead.
And then the collision occurs.
That is the critical, unavoidable intersection. The heavy, abrasive, osteoderm-lined belly of the caiman drags forcefully across the hidden dorsal disc of the ray. Now, consider the difference in reaction times between a mammalian predator and this ray. A jaguar plans an ambush, it calculates distance and timing. The stingray's strike is not a conscious decision, it is a hardwired autonomic reflex.
It's automatic.
The instant a massive crushing weight registers on the mechanoreceptors across her back, her central nervous system triggers a defensive sequence in milliseconds.
And the mechanics of the strike itself explain the bizarre forensic evidence on the bodies. It is not a forward thrust.
Our human frame of reference often pictures a scorpion reaching over its head, or a human lunging forward with a spear. But the stingray's primary weapon is located at the base of a highly muscular prehensile tail. When the reflex is triggered, the tail arches backward and snaps upward with explosive kinetic energy.
The bottom-up ascending wound.
Precisely. The caiman is gliding horizontally over the top of her, and her tail whips violently upward, driving the weapon directly into the most exposed, softest tissue available, the ventral underbelly, completely bypassing the heavy dorsal chainmail that protects the caiman from top-down attacks.
The structural engineering of the weapon itself is staggering. We are talking about the stinger here. This isn't just a sharp piece of bone, it's a mechanism designed for maximum mechanical and chemical devastation. On a massive 100-kilogram female Potamotrygon Brachyura, what are the dimensions of this weapon?
A female of that extreme size could possess a primary stinger exceeding 25 centimeters in length.
Wow.
We are talking about 10 inches of rigid, flattened, highly mineralized dentin and cartilage. But the lethality isn't just in the length, it is the microstructure. The lateral edges of the stinger are lined with rows of vicious, backward-facing serrations.
It is essentially a biological saw blade where the teeth point in the wrong direction for a clean exit.
Exactly. The initial upward thrust is incredibly sharp, easily slicing through the tough reptilian skin and penetrating deep into the abdominal cavity. The entry is devastating, but the retraction is catastrophic.
Because it pulls back.
Right. When the reflex completes and the ray whips her muscular tail back down to reset, those backward-facing serrations hook into the caiman's muscles, connective tissue, and blood vessels. The stinger does not slide out smoothly. It violently saws, shreds, and lacerates the internal anatomy on the way out.
The mechanical torque during that retraction must be immense, which perfectly explains the microscopic forensic evidence. The stress of ripping that serrated blade out of a thrashing, heavily muscled caiman is so extreme that fragments of the stinger itself, the dentin and mineralized cartilage, shatter and break off, remaining permanently embedded deep inside the wound channel.
The mechanical trauma alone, the severe internal hemorrhaging and structural tissue damage, is profound. But it's only the first phase of the ray's defensive strategy.
Right, because a deep laceration, even a 10-inch deep laceration, shouldn't instantly doom a Pantanal Caiman. I mean, these are animals that routinely survive horrific territorial combat with each other. They literally tear limbs off in dominance disputes and survive. So how does one single stab wound completely shut down a 2.5-meter apex predator?
Because the mechanical trauma is immediately followed by aggressive chemical warfare. The stingray's barb is not just a knife, it is a sophisticated delivery system. The stinger is enveloped in a thin, specialized integumentary sheath, a layer of glandular tissue that constantly produces and stores a highly complex, powerfully necrotizing venom.
And when we use the term necrotizing, we are talking about a venom specifically designed to induce cellular death. It is flesh-eating.
At a cellular level, yes. When the stinger forcibly enters the caiman, the mechanical friction ruptures that venomous sheath. This action deposits a concentrated cocktail of toxic proteins and enzymes directly into the deepest part of the wound channel. And in an outlier specimen of this colossal size, the volume of venom delivered is staggering.
Right, bigger ray, bigger payload.
Exactly. A larger stinger means a significantly larger surface area of glandular tissue, resulting in a massive toxic payload injected during a single strike.
What is the actual biochemical mechanism of this venom? Like, what is it doing to the caiman's internal systems once it's injected?
The venom of freshwater stingrays is notoriously complex, containing enzymes like hyaluronidase, which breaks down the connective tissue and allows the toxins to spread rapidly.
Spreading the damage.
Yes. And phospholipids, which aggressively attack cell membranes. But its primary devastating effect is on the vascular system. The venom severely damages the endothelial cells lining the blood vessels, causing them to break down and completely restricting local blood flow. Without arterial blood delivering oxygen, the tissue surrounding the wound rapidly suffocates and undergoes necrosis.
This perfectly explains the black halo the researchers observed during the necropsies. The tissue is literally dying, turning black, and rotting while the animal is still alive.
It is rapid onset, localized necrosis. However, even a venom yield of that magnitude wouldn't cause instantaneous systemic failure in a reptile possessing the sheer mass and robust immune system of a large caiman. The toxicity induces agonizing pain and tissue death, but it takes time to circulate. This introduces the third and ultimately fatal phase of the lethal triad.
The environment of the Pantanal itself becomes the final weapon.
Exactly. Consider the physical state of the caiman post-strike. It had a massive, jagged, open abdominal wound, packed with rapidly necrotizing tissue and shattered fragments of a venomous barb. And this severely compromised animal is swimming through the hot, stagnant, anoxic waters of the Vazante.
It's essentially swimming in a hyper-concentrated microbial broth.
The bacterial load in those shrinking hot lagoons is astronomically high. Pathogens flood into the open necrotic wound. A massive secondary bacterial infection is virtually guaranteed, and it progresses with terrifying speed.
So mapping out the timeline of the fatality, the caiman doesn't die instantly upon impact on the sandbank. It absorbs the kinetic and chemical strike, likely thrashes in absolute agony, and manages to swim away from the immediate area, moving further down the channel into the lagoon.
It likely believes it has escaped the threat, but the biological clock has started. Over the next 12 to 48 hours, the lethal triad systematically dismantles the animal. The internal hemorrhaging drains its physical stamina. The necrotizing venom aggressively destroys the surrounding vascular tissue, causing massive cellular breakdown and compounding the shock. And finally, the unchecked bacterial infection permeates the bloodstream.
It just shuts down.
The caiman's robust physiology simply collapses under the combined weight of trauma, toxemia, and severe sepsis. It runs out of metabolic energy, drifts into the shallow margins of the water, and quietly expires.
Which meticulously answers every single anomalous question from the initial crime scene. It explains why the bodies were found perfectly intact, distance away from the actual attack site, because the toxic shock took hours to kill them. And it explains the lack of a chaotic struggle, because by the time they died, they simply shut down.
It's a profoundly grim way to die.
It really is. But looking at the broader ecological context, a massive question remains. Why here? Why now? Caimans and stingrays are both ancient species. They have coexisted in the vast Pantanal basin for millions of years. Why did this specific isolated sandbank suddenly transform into a lethal choke point?
To understand the why, we have to look at the macrogeography of the Vazante. The dry season in the Pantanal isn't just a period of less rain. It is a fundamental, drastic restructuring of the entire biome. During the wet season, the Pantanal is a vast, interconnected, flooded plain spanning thousands of square kilometers. Animals can disperse widely, but as the waters recede, that immense volume of water drains away, leaving isolated, shrinking lagoons connected only by shallow, narrow channels.
The landscape acts like a giant funnel, dragging the entire aquatic ecosystem toward the lowest points of elevation.
Precisely. And this specific sandbank, where the colossal ray had stationed herself, was a geographical inevitability. For the caimans, utilizing that channel was mandatory. As their immediate hunting grounds dried up and the capybara and fish populations moved, the caimans had to migrate. That sandbank was the shortest, most direct navigational route between their dwindling resources. They had to swim over it to survive.
But what about the stingray? She isn't migrating to hunt capybara. Why is she parked directly in the middle of a high-traffic reptilian highway?
Because that specific topography offered a localized resource critical to her own survival: oxygen.
Oh, right.
The shallow water physically flowing over the slight elevation of the sandbank would be significantly more oxygenated than the deep, stagnant, rotting water of the isolated lagoons. For a massive 100-kilogram female, especially one that might be gestating pups, which places immense metabolic demand on her system, finding a microhabitat with sufficient oxygen flow is paramount. She wasn't seeking a confrontation, she was seeking a respiratory refuge.
So this entire scenario isn't a war between rival species. It's a tragedy of geography. You have two massive, ancient animals forced into the exact same localized square of mud by overwhelming environmental pressure.
Two entirely different, highly specialized survival strategies, attempting to occupy the exact same spatial coordinates simultaneously. This dynamic perfectly illustrates a concept in behavioral ecology we refer to as clashing invisibilities.
That concept is fascinating. Let's dig deeper into how those invisibilities interact.
It highlights a profound biological irony. The stingray buries herself in the substrate to achieve total invisibility. Her goal is to remain entirely undisturbed by potential threats or passing megafauna.
Right.
Conversely, the caiman swims low against the benthic layer, utilizing the extreme turbidity of the water to mask its massive silhouette. Its goal is to remain invisible to sneak up on prey. Both organisms are heavily leveraging the opacity of the environment, but for diametrically opposed biological imperatives.
They are essentially cloaked from one another until the exact moment of physical contact. The caiman's visual perception cannot penetrate the mud to see the buried trap, and the ray's sensory apparatus doesn't register the incoming threat until the immense physical weight is already bearing down on her dorsal disc.
And that precise moment of blind intersection fundamentally redefines how we conceptualize the hierarchy of nature. Humans possess a deeply ingrained, almost rigidly linear view of the animal kingdom. We construct trophic pyramids in our minds.
We think in absolute terms. The lion is at the top, the gazelle is at the bottom. We assume that the creature with the largest mass, the thickest dermal armor, and the highest bite force quotient possesses unquestionable dominance in its environment.
We assume apex predators operate with absolute impunity, vulnerable only to larger apex predators. But the data gathered by Apex Truth completely dismantles that hierarchical pyramid.
Because in the murky water of that specific channel, power is completely decoupled from offensive strength. Survival didn't depend on jaw mechanics, and it didn't depend on interlocking osteoderms.
Power, in this highly specific context, was dictated entirely by anatomy, spatial positioning, and the micro-timing of a reflex arc. It is a masterclass in situational dominance. The colossal ray possessed no intent to kill an apex predator. She was merely defending her highly localized territory, her source of oxygen, utilizing a biological mechanism evolved for maximum immediate deterrence.
Right.
But because she was positioned perfectly in the geographical choke point, and because the caiman's unarmored underbelly dragged across her mechanoreceptors at precisely the wrong angle, the undisputed king of the river was instantly transformed into a casualty.
Touching the wrong patch of mud at the exact wrong millisecond turned an invincible, heavily armored giant into a victim of a hardwired biological reflex. It is a truly humbling perspective on ecosystem dynamics. So once the research team pieced this entire forensic puzzle together, what was the protocol? Did they attempt to capture or relocate the ray to prevent further caiman fatalities?
The actions of the research team reflect the highest standards of modern conservation ethics. There was no anthropogenic intervention. There was no attempt to capture, relocate, or neutralize the animal. They recognized that she was not an anomaly. She was an integral, naturally occurring component of the Pantanal ecosystem.
She wasn't a rogue killer. She was just existing perfectly within her ecological niche, responding to the extreme pressures of the dry season exactly as evolution programmed her to do.
To interfere with her presence would be to arrogantly disrupt the natural, albeit brutal, mechanics of the biome. The researchers meticulously recorded the acoustic imaging from the side-scan sonar, documented the staggering physical dimensions of the specimen, logged the geographical coordinates, and then quietly withdrew, leaving the colossal female completely undisturbed in her sandy refuge.
But what I found most remarkable about the aftermath of this study is the behavioral data regarding the remaining caiman population. Because the bodies stopped piling up, the fatalities ceased.
The local death toll dropped to zero. In the weeks following the sonar discovery, the researchers continued to monitor the movement patterns of the surviving caimans in that specific lagoon system. They observed a distinct rapid shift in behavioral ecology. The caimans completely ceased utilizing that direct, highly efficient route over the sandbank.
Just stop going there.
Entirely. Instead, they began expending significantly more energy to navigate longer, more arduous, and shallower paths along the extreme margins of the waterway, purposefully bypassing the death corridor entirely.
Which is an incredible demonstration of intelligence. I mean, it isn't as if these reptiles possess an inherent understanding of the complex biochemistry of necrotizing hyaluronidase enzymes. They don't have a taxonomic classification for Potamotrygon Brachyura.
They absolutely don't need to. In extreme environments, survival relies heavily on rapid associative learning. They don't require an intellectual understanding of the biological mechanism driving the threat. They only need to accurately map the geography of the risk. If several large, dominant males utilize a specific channel and never return, or if the surviving population detects the chemical or acoustic distress signals of a struck animal rapidly succumbing to toxic shock in the lagoon, a powerful associative link is forged. The neural pathway is established. That specific set of geographical coordinates correlates directly with extreme lethal danger.
So they adapt their migratory patterns. They abandon the most efficient route in favor of survival, effectively ceding that territory to the unseen threat beneath the mud.
And by doing so, they leave the colossal female exactly where she was, hidden beneath the silt, fully oxygenated and completely undisturbed. A living, breathing, venomous landmine that successfully defended her critical microhabitat against the most heavily armored dominant predators in the entire river system, all without ever revealing her shape.
It is an example of a perfectly balanced, self-correcting ecological interaction.
It is biology functioning at its most raw and efficient level.
It truly inspires a sense of awe. After unpacking this, it is impossible to look at a muddy, stagnant river the same way again. We've spent this entire deep dive stripping away the surface layers, exploring a complex ecosystem where, beneath just a few inches of opaque water, evolution has engineered weapons and defensive adaptations so perfectly calibrated that they don't even need to show their faces to completely neutralize giants. The biggest teeth and the thickest armor do not always guarantee victory. Sometimes, the undisputed victor of a biological clash is the organism you never even perceived.
It serves as a profound, humbling reminder of the sheer complexity, the hidden lethality, and the fragile balance of the natural world.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this investigation, I want to leave you, the listener, with a broader concept to mull over today. We have just meticulously explored how the shrinking, drying waterways of the Pantanal Vazante forced a hidden 100-kilogram venomous giant into a deadly, unavoidable collision course with apex predators. But zoom out and consider the macro-environmental picture. Across the globe, our planet's river systems, vast lakes, and vital wetlands are shrinking, drying up, and fundamentally altering at unprecedented, historically rapid rates. If a seasonally lowering waterline in one Brazilian lagoon can trigger a localized, highly lethal war between invisible giants, well, what other massive, ancient, and perfectly camouflaged defense mechanisms are currently waiting to be triggered in shifting ecosystems all over the world? As the global waters continue to recede and habitats compress, what else is hiding, waiting just beneath the mud?